Hello, everyone. I want to give a warm welcome to each of you to Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jacqueline Martinez, and I am a senior in the college, majoring in economics and minoring in Portuguese. I am one of the many undocumented, undocumented undergraduate, graduate, and staff on campus. I'm here tonight to join others in going beyond the wall in the topic of immigration and sharing a story that I hope will serve to ground us for the rest of the evening. I was asked to share my story as an immigrant, a student, and a recipient of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, also known as DACA. But I really had in my heart to use this opportunity to tell the story of someone else, of someone that I think will never perhaps get to share his story on a stage like this. Tonight, I want to share the story of a man named Jose Valmore, who is also known to his family and friends as Maurice. Maurice was born in 1958 in the small Central American country of El Salvador. Despite being an inquisitive and curious child, he was only able to attend school for a couple of years because his family held the mantra that letters don't feed you, so school doesn't matter. As the oldest son in the family, his responsibility was to help his single mother make ends meet and care for his younger blind brother. At the age of 12, his mother passed away. And although his grandmother took him in, he knew that the days of being just a kid had passed away, and that he was now being called at such a young age to be a man that had to fend for himself. In the early 1980s, civil war broke out in El Salvador, and Maurice was drafted to join the military that was being financed by the United States to put an end to the unrest caused by the left-wing group. In hindsight, we know that this civil war was the result of El Salvadorians being tired of the vast and ridiculous inequality that had persisted for so long, benefiting only the rich. But this is how Maurice remembers it. It was a time of confusion. No one really understood the reasons for fighting. Men were expected to take arms and kill their brothers or neighbors if they were declared to be an enemy of the state. In 1998, 6 years after peace had been declared, El Salvador struggled to recover from war in all aspects. Now married with 3 children, Maurice knew that the opportunities didn't look so promising in the land where he had labored since his youth. So he decided to leave it all behind to ensure a better life for them. As someone with little to no formal education or professional background, Maurice would have never qualified for a working visa or a green card or sponsorship. So he took a chance. And after 3 years of being in the United States, he qualified for temporary protection status in 2001, also known as TPS, after a disastrous earthquake occurred in El Salvador. With this new status, he was able to work in a more stable job with benefits and save up to have his wife and 2 daughters join him in this country. Today, Maurice lives in Northern Virginia with his family. He works afternoon shifts at an elementary school doing maintenance work. Last year, when he heard the news that the president was considering ending the temporary protection status that enables him to work, he went into his room with his wife and 2 daughters, and they started praying through the tears. Now, I tell you the story of this man because he's a personal hero of mine. Maurice is my father. And I tell his story as an attempt to end the narrative that dreamers are only those undocumented immigrants that attend prestigious universities like Georgetown University, and those that make headlines with their accolades and achievements. But as many of my fellow undocumented students at Georgetown can testify, our parents were the original dreamers that carried with them a love for their family that led them to do whatever was necessary to ensure a better life for them. As content creators, Dave Frank would say, "Let me not be so vain to think that I am the sole author of my victories. I am not." So as you process the story of my father and you continue to hear the stories of wonderful DACA recipients who are valedictorians of their school, who graduate from elite universities and get law degrees, I hope that you would be challenged to deconstruct the narrative that demands that you pick between a deserving and an undeserving immigrant. And that you look beyond the external criteria of merit and consider the humanity and dignity of the people that migrated to this country and are still migrating to this country, risking everything in hopes of a better and more dignified life. Now, as an undocumented person myself, realizing that most people in this room probably are not, I think that it's my responsibility to share with you two matters that are important if you decide to become an ally and join the movement to humanize the conversation around immigration. I'll begin with one thing that I don't think the immigrant community needs more of, and that is pity. If I share the story of my father and all I am able to evoke in you is pity, then I fear that we're gonna have to continue having gatherings like this and continuing to have conversations such as the ones that we will have tonight for a longer time than we desire or expect. Immigrants don't need pity for the hardships that they lived. Much more than that, what is needed in this conversation is compassionate partnership. Compassion, unlike pity, a friend explained to me the other day, is not concerned with how bad you feel about the person suffering, but it's rather focusing on the person undergoing the difficulties. When we learn to be compassionate, we think less of ourselves and how bad we feel for others, and we are rather driven to act, to partner with these people to defend their dignity and humanity. I hope that as I stand here tonight, I don't sound like a moralist that is somehow more enlightened, or as some of my peers would say, more woke than you. As a Christian, I live under the conviction that I am also a faulty and broken human who loves imperfectly, who cares imperfectly, who advocates imperfectly. That the only reason why I have a right standing with God and my other fellow humans is not because of my efforts, but because of what Christ has accomplished on the cross and in his resurrection. That grace that was granted to me is the main reason that I'm able to stand here and extend grace to myself when I failed to meet expectations as an immigrant and as an advocate. But thankfully, I'm also able to extend grace to those that still stand on a different side of this debate. And I understand that we need to engage with those that disagree with us if we ever hope to drive policy forward. So I'm very grateful to the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought in Public Life for hosting this important gathering on the human impacts, moral principles, and policy directions on immigration. Tonight, you will hear from 4 panelists: a religious woman on the front lines of the crisis, a moral theologian, an advocate to the U.S. bishops on immigration issues, and an evangelical leader on immigration. And now I want to introduce John Carr, the director of the initiative and the moderator for tonight's dialogue. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm happy to add my own words of welcome. We usually have big shots introduce our dialogues. We've been honored to have the president of the university, officials of the university, cardinals, politicians. We've never had a better introduction. You know why we're here, and you're here in such remarkable numbers. The current divisions over a border wall and immigration have shut down parts of the federal government, fundamentally divided Congress and the president and our nation, undermined the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of both government workers and immigrant families. The shutdown could come back, or we could have an emergency of some sort. declared. This is an emergency, but not maybe that kind of an emergency. It's an emergency created by a lack of focus on the human and the moral dimensions of this crisis. So while the 24-hour news cycle focuses on the power and the personalities and what this means for 2020, this dialogue tries to look beyond the politics and the anger and fear to focus on the human costs and moral principles. So this won't sound like one of the Sunday morning shows. This won't look like a panel on CNN or Fox. It's not a policy seminar, and it's not a rally for immigration reform. It's an attempt to go deeper into what is human about this crisis, what is moral about this crisis, and what might be a way out. Who are the people coming to our southern border, and why? What are the principles, the moral principles, the ethical principles that ought to guide a response? How should the experience we've just heard about, how should the story of Jacqueline and Maurice impact this discussion? What is fundamental and what is prudential? What can we compromise on, and what should we hold fast to? And finally, what are our responsibilities as a university, as an initiative, as citizens, as non-citizens? And we have a wonderful group of people to talk about not just DACA, not just TPS, not just a wall, but about human beings and what kind of country we are becoming. And what I'm going to do is ask each of our colleagues a question, introduce them to you, and then ask the whole group a series of questions. And there will be time for your questions. And then we'll wrap up, and then there will be a reception for all of us upstairs in the atrium where we can have a little dessert, maybe a glass of wine or a cup of coffee. So we're delighted you're here. Let me begin with Sister Norma. Sister Norma is many things. Among other things, she's the Pope's favorite nun.
I wish he knew that.
I don't know if you've heard the story, but there was a town hall. The Holy Father wanted to go to the border when he came to the United States, and he couldn't for a variety of reasons. And I'll make this quick, but ABC arranged a town hall, and the Holy Father was on a big screen, and it was wonderful, these impassioned stories, and the Holy Father would, at his best, he looked and sounded like Jesus. And at the very end, he said, "There's a sister out there, and I want to see her." And he said, "I want to thank you for your work. I congratulate you. Move forward." And he says, "I love you very much." He said, "Is it all right for the Pope to say, 'I love you very much'?" And it was all right. And we love Sister Norma very much. She's been to Georgetown. Georgetown is helping Sister Norma in her amazing work, and we're proud to be a part of it. She's a missionary of Jesus. She has lots of degrees. She is director of Catholic Charities in McCollum, Texas. But what she has become known for is the amazing respite center in a country which can't figure out how to welcome people. Sister Norma welcomes people every day, hundreds of people in our name. And for this, she got the Laetare Medal at Notre Dame. You may have heard of that place. She just received the Margaret Cafferty Award from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. More than anything else, at a time when people talk about walls, Sister Norma builds bridges. So, sister, let me be a little pushy about this. Help us, help others who aren't here. Who are these people? Why are they coming? Who would risk this? Who would bring their children so far? What happens when they arrive? What are in their hearts? What is going on that people make this journey? And how do you welcome them in our name? And how do you work with the Border Patrol to give them a place? Help us understand the human part of this.
John, since June of 2014, we received so many hundreds of families the very first day. And we didn't really know what was going to happen or what we were doing as far as whether it's going to be 1 day, 1 week, or we had no clue. But yet the community, all the people from our community just gathered together and wanted to help. So that was our first initial response. And my very first encounter with the families was one evening, just to tell you the kind of people that are coming from so far away. I was also like, why are they coming? So many hundreds of them. And one evening, I had this lady, very petite young mom. She was pregnant, like real pregnant. And I asked her, when are you due? And she says, yeah. What do you mean, yeah? You know, like now? You know, like, how could you do this to yourself? You know, how can you go for, how long have you been on this journey since from Honduras? And she said, a month. And she had a little girl. I think she must have been 3, 4 years old. And why? Why would you come? And her response was, she showed me her hand, she pulled it out, and it was all disfigured. And you see this? You know, the reason why it's like this is because somebody entered my house and instructed my daughter to kill her. And I put my hand to save her. And I wasn't able to go to the doctor or to the hospital. It healed on its own at home. So I got cut here and everywhere. Had we stayed, we would not be alive today. I come because of her. And like this mother, so many other hundreds of mothers and fathers have done this long journey that pushes them out of their country because they're afraid mostly of their children. And you can experience this and see that's when you go visit and be part of this experience and encounter them in that moment where you see them and they share their story. And you begin to understand that this is a group of people that are the first victims of crime. You know, they're victimized, and they are running away from that and encountering that crime all along their journey, and even to the time they arrive to our border in the United States, right, with Mexico. Always afraid, hopeful that maybe they have a chance for life.
Sister, one of the things that strikes me about your work is in a country that is exceedingly polarized about this, you have gotten people to work together. One of my favorite stories, you have a fundraiser, a bike-a-thon, and the head of the Border Patrol rode in the bike-a-thon. That's not my image of how this thing works.
Well, you know, the border is a very special place. The Rio Grande Valley, it's a group of people that we know how to work together. How we can put aside politics, we can put aside our differences and find common ground. Find where we understand our role to defend life. And the Border Patrol, like the city officials, like all of us that work within any church, we all understand the importance of defending human life and protecting it. And so that's why I'm friends with the Chief of Border Patrol, you know, and we get together and talk about what's the best way that we can address what we're facing here at the border.
You were invited at the last minute, I think, to be in the room when President Trump went to the border, which was the good news. The bad news is you didn't get a chance to speak.
Yes, he was not interested. Well,
why don't you share with us what you would have told the president?
Why do I know that you were going to ask that question?
Because I'm your friend.
Well, you know, I think that he had a plan already ahead of, you know, he planned to set up a way that he can show the reasons why he wants to declare this a disaster at the border. He didn't want anyone to talk to him other than those people that would support the reasons why he was there, to show that there was an emergency, a disaster, a humanitarian disaster that he needed to address and he needed funding for. And so we were not really in his plan to speak. You know, he brought everybody that wanted him, he wanted for them to talk, and so we were just spectators there seeing what he was showing.
If on the way out you had a minute with him?
No, I didn't see the...
What would you have said if you did have a minute?
What would I say? I would have invited him to the respite center. I would have said, Mr. President, I think it would be important and very helpful for you to meet the families. and come to our respite center. I would have said that.
Wow. We have had two very powerful testimonies on the human side of this, a mother who protected her child, a daughter who loves her father. David, help us understand the moral questions. What are the principles? People are throwing around the Bible on various sides. A wall is immoral. A wall is absolutely required. In the Catholic tradition, help us understand this. For those of you who don't know Father Hollenbeck, this, I think, is the preeminent theologian on Catholic social teaching, particularly on human rights, who has focused his work on the question of migrants and refugees. He's at the Berkeley Center here. He's part of he's the Arupe Scholar here at the School of Foreign Service. And Arupe Scholar means people think you're really smart. That's very high praise. He was a leader at Boston College, ran an important center there. He was at the Library of Congress. The part about David that most impresses me, he's been to the Philippines. He's been to Vietnam. He's been to South Sudan. And he spent a lot of time in Africa helping the church learn more and do more in terms of human rights. He's been president of the Catholic Theological Society, but he's also been a pastor and a teacher who has helped us understand what are the moral foundations for making judgments in this area. So David, as we look at this, what are the principles? What is the criteria we ought to be thinking about?
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks all of you for coming to talk about this very important subject tonight. I would start off to respond to your question by saying that the most fundamental moral and I would say religious principle behind the way we should approach these questions is that we are all part of one human family. The family of humanity reaches across borders. There are connections between human beings across borders that enable us to see one another as brothers and sisters, members of the same family, created by the same God, in the image of the same God. And that common family that binds us together as fellow brother and sister humans led Pope John XXIII in his highly regarded encyclical Pacem in Terris to say this. He said, "The fact that one is a citizen of a particular state, like us here in the US, does not in any way detract from his or her membership in the human family as a whole, or from his or her citizenship in the world community." So when we look at these mothers coming with their children, or DACA students and their fathers, we have to remember they are all part of our family, our common human family. And that means that those seeking asylum from violence, as refugees seeking asylum in this country, have rights because of their common humanity along with us. The dignity of every human person created in the image and likeness of God gives every person a genuine set of human rights. The rights to basically flee if their lives are at stake. A right to find a place to live if they can't live at home in their home country of Salvador or Nicaragua or Guatemala or any part of the northern triangle of Central America where so many people are coming from. So I would say that's a starting point. The second point, though, is despite that, states and borders matter. We recognize that we have obligations to our fellow citizens in this country, just like being a member of an individual family. My mother and father and my brothers and sisters and me, I have special obligations to my spouse, to my children, and so forth. But that obligation to fellow citizens like obligations to members of my own family, doesn't mean I don't have any obligations to anybody else outside my family. So borders between families and borders between countries are significant, but they're not absolute. And our responsibilities reach across those borders, just as there are responsibilities internally to them. That means then, from a moral point of view and an ethical point of view, we need to think carefully about our priorities. How do we put our responsibilities to our fellow citizens here in this country in relationship to our responsibilities to those from El Salvador or Nicaragua or Guatemala or wherever they may be coming from, South Sudan? How do we put together some priorities? And as I think about priorities, I go back to a case that occurred quite a few years ago. It was back in the early 1970s. It's a famous case that took place in the Kew Gardens section of New York, where a young woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered on the streets of New York while 38 people looked by and did nothing. 38 people watched her being killed. No one even called the police. And people afterwards said, I didn't kill her, it wasn't my responsibility. The case, though, led many people to say, even though you have not caused this problem, you still have a responsibility to take action, to do something about it. Call the police, take some action to prevent this murder from occurring. And a couple of friends of mine who worked on thinking about this came up with a set of criteria for setting priorities about how to balance these kinds of responsibilities that they called the Kew Gardens principle, because this murder took place in the Kew Gardens section of New York. And they said, if someone is in grave danger, and if I didn't cause the problem, I still have a responsibility to act under several conditions. One, there is grave need. Number two, I have proximity, I'm nearby. Number three, I have the capability. I can do something about it. Number four, nobody else is likely to do anything. And finally, I can act without a disproportionate burden on myself. Well, it seems to me, even though we have responsibilities to our own citizens in this country, we have responsibilities to the people coming from the Northern Triangle of Central America, the Salvadorans, the Nicaraguans, the Guatemalans, that meet those criteria. There's grave need. These people are fleeing for their lives, as we have heard. Secondly, we're proximate, we're nearby. Thirdly, we have a capability to do something about it. You look at the United States, and there's all this argument about how can we handle all these refugees coming in. Compare the United States to Lebanon. In Lebanon today, 1 out of every 4 people inside the country is a refugee from another country, 25%. If we admitted that number of refugees to the United States, we'd go over the top of the number of refugees there are in the world. There aren't that many refugees to admit. So we have the capacity, the capability to take action to aid these people, not only because of our wealth, but because of the fact that we have resources to help them. And finally, it seems to me that there are ways in which we can do this without disproportionate burden on ourselves. We have the resources to do this, just as when Angela Merkel admitted all the Syrian refugees into Germany, she made the famous statement in German, "Wir schaffen das," we can handle it. Well, she's been held accountable for that, but the fact is, even though 1 million refugees fled into Germany, Germany isn't anything like the situation in Lebanon. David Cameron, who was at the time the Prime Minister of the UK, said, oh, well, the UK will live up to its moral responsibilities. We will admit 20,000 Syrian refugees over the next 5 years. One of the ministers of Lebanon said, thank you very much, Mr. Cameron, We in Lebanon admitted that number over the last 2 weekends. So the burden is, we have the capacity. So that's enough for the moment.
Last night, given your knowledge of Catholic social teaching, a question occurred to me. Is it a violation of the option for the poor to root for the New England Patriots? As a Boston.
Having lived in Boston for many years, I would say yes, but it doesn't really matter.
Galen Carey is the Vice President for Governmental Relations of the National Association of Evangelicals. He is a good friend. He's a colleague. Before joining the National Association of Evangelicals, he worked for their relief arm in Croatia, Mozambique, Kenya, Indonesia, and Burundi. He has degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, McCormick Theological Seminary. He's a partner of ours in the Circle of Protection. He and his wife have been regular participants in our dialogues and activities. I think he's a better example of Catholic social teaching than most Catholics I know. My favorite story about Galen is he and I went to the White House together and suggested that what President Obama needed to do was to come to a meeting we were organizing of Catholics and evangelicals and be on a panel on poverty. And they sort of laughed at us and they said, this president doesn't talk about poverty very much and no president does panels. And Galen's a very persistent fellow. And we were all persistent, and we asked if they would simply present this idea to the president. And as some of you know, in our first convening, we actually had the President of the United States in a panel on poverty, talking with the head of a conservative think tank and a Harvard professor. This partnership between Catholics and evangelicals has been a very powerful one. We share some common values. One of the things we share in common, I saw a poll that a majority of white evangelicals and a majority of white Catholics support the wall. Galen's leadership, his organization's leadership, have been trying to persuade his own people and the leaders of our country that there are better ways, more human ways, more moral ways. What are the obligations of the church in the middle of a fight like this when the country is so polarized, so angry? How can you be the church when the people are so divided?
That's a great question, John. And I think where I would start is taking a thought from a book that a good friend of mine has written called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. Matthew Kamenk has made the argument that in order to show hospitality, you need first of all to have a host who receives then a guest in their home. And when we apply this idea to nation states, it means that it's necessary and appropriate that we have borders and laws that define who belongs in this nation, whose home it is, and who is being invited in. And so I would start, John, by saying that to be responsible as Christians and as the church, we should acknowledge that we support strong border security and upholding the rule of law, and that we do this not just as a rhetorical concession to political expediency, because we know we're not going to get anywhere unless we do that, but rather because that this is part of what it means to show hospitality. There has to be an understanding of who it is that's showing hospitality. The problem with open borders is not that it's too generous, but it's that it so blurs the distinctions between insiders and outsiders that it erodes the very basis for hospitality. Just a simple example, my wife and I, over the years, have had the opportunity to host many refugee families in our home, some for days, some for weeks, even some for months. It's been a great blessing, I'm sure more to us than to anybody else. But it was important that there was a clear understanding that we're hosting these people, but at some point they're going to move on and get their own place, and our family will carry on with its normal life. And so then we were able to be generous in our hospitality. So as a nation, it seems to me that we have a responsibility, and as Christians especially, that we have a responsibility most of all to demonstrate and bear witness to God's love in Jesus Christ. As Jacqueline mentioned in her opening comments, that it's the grace of God that comes to every person, and that more than anything else, what immigrants need is the love of God more than they need legal status or a job or a family reunification or integration, any of those things. And so that's our responsibility, first of all. And any time that our government would require us to make distinctions in how we minister to people, that we would be obligated to resist that. That doesn't mean that we have to necessarily violate our nation's laws, but it means that our ministries of evangelism and hospitality must not discriminate on the basis of immigration status. So where immigrants do lack status, it seems to me that our responsibility as Christians is, first of all, to help them, if there is any way to help them to adjust their status, so we help them to do that. Of course, for many, we know that there isn't any current recourse, and that's where we come to the question of advocating for changes in our laws. I'm sure we'll talk about later. But then there's also the people who now have status and are on the cusp of losing that status, and it seems that's a very urgent, to borrow David's term, of grave danger. That's a case where there is a grave danger facing a lot of our neighbors, and so it seems that we're responsible to try to do something about that where we can. Now, we should also, though, be concerned about the immigrants who are not here yet, those who wish to come here in the future. So we should be advocating for a just immigration system that allows people to come here in a legal way, both for family reunification and to help in areas where our economy needs help. And I think that in many ways, in our case, immigration is such a win-win proposition that the idea of sacrifice doesn't really even come into the picture. That throughout our history, our receiving and welcoming of immigrants, as fitful as it has been a great benefit and blessing to us, as well as to those, mostly those who came. And so we should be, I think, eager to do even more. And then finally, I would just emphasize and underline our special responsibility to receive refugees and those fleeing persecution, both those who have been identified overseas as among the most vulnerable and who need a place to go, as well as those who are already here and who are in fear of being returned to places of persecution. So this is a place where, in fact, there is a very strong call on our conscience. And as a nation, actually, we can be proud of a long history of doing this reasonably well until recently. In the last couple of years, there have been major problems and changes in policy that need to be turned around. And so as Christians, we need to be speaking to our leaders about that, and then doing what we can with the people who are most proximate to us to welcome them on a personal basis.
Galen, the evangelical community is known for its pro-life, pro-family witness and advocacy. What was your response when we saw children literally being taken from their mothers as a tactic, apparently to discourage people from coming? I know you provided leadership, your community provided leadership. What is the moral urgency and the responsibility of the church faced with a situation like that?
Well, we know that the family is the fundamental building block of society, that it predates government, it predates even church, and it's part of God's original plan. So anytime we're going up against God's original plan, I think there's a problem. It's something we need to address, and we need to make sure that families can stay together.
Okay. Ashley Feasley is, you think you have a hard job. She represents the Catholic bishops in the immigration debate. The church is in crisis, the country's in chaos, and you're in the middle of both those.
These days, yes.
But she does an incredible job of bringing the principles that David has talked about, the experience that Sister Norma represents, and the witness of faith that Galen talked, to Capitol Hill. Help us understand where things are at this point and where there might be possibilities to talk about TPS for Maurice, or DACA for Jacqueline, or a future for the asylum seekers who show up in Sister Norma's respite center. How in the middle of this mess can we find a way to use our voices to make a difference?
Sure. So first off, I'd like to say...
I forgot to tell people all the wonderful things you've done. Of course, the most important thing, she graduated from Georgetown School of Foreign Service.
That's right.
She also got a law degree from Fordham, which I guess counts. And she taught at the Catholic U. I've heard of that. That's Crosstown. But she has focused her legal work and her professional life on immigration and refugee matters. And she appears before Congress. She helps people like us understand these issues. She's been a clerk for a judge. She's a friend and an ally. She's been a part of a lot of things we've done. But she brings enormous energy, enormous faith, and enormous skills to an incredibly difficult task in a divided country. So where can we find a way to make a difference? What's going on? What might be possible?
Sure. So thank you very much, John. I'm super grateful for the opportunity to speak tonight and for the work of the initiative. And I also would like to say thank you to Georgetown University. You have provided a model for many other universities, Jesuit, Catholic, and faith-based universities, in your working with undocumented students, grad students, undergrads, and professionals. I was just at a conference this weekend, the American Catholic Colleges and Universities Association, and it was wonderful to see Georgetown's work in action. So I am a proud Hoya alum, and I will continue, but thank you to the university for your constant witness and your advocacy and also your direct service. So obviously we've heard quite a bit about the wall and the corresponding 35-day shutdown that affected so many government workers and then contractors and had so many effects. Many of you know about a week and change ago, our leaders agreed to a short-term continuing resolution. So we're operating kind of on borrowed time. The next deadline is the 15th of February. Things are going to get real interesting here in the next couple days because the elected individuals who've been selected from their party are in the process of negotiating what we all hope, I think, will move forward with the funding of the government at full levels, but also move forward with this discussion. I think if you see the media, you may think that we're at an impasse on the wall or border security. And indeed, this panel is very timely because, frankly, it is much beyond the wall. We're seeing a larger impasse on how our country views immigrants and refugees. Okay, we have competing visions for what that treatment looks like, and even competing versions for what can make us safe and if we are safe. So it is a really important moment, I think. I lay that out, and many of you may throw up your hands and say, well, what are we supposed to do? I think that the important thing to recognize is we have to continue to advocate for immigrants and refugees and on this issue in the face of some of these negotiations that are going on. It's vital, I think, that we continue to do that because this debate is about more than the wall. It's about our country, sovereignty, how we treat and welcome the stranger, and who we are as a people, as a faith in our history. So I look forward to talking a little bit more, but I will say to you, we expect the lawmakers to come up with their agreement here on Friday that they have to present to their respective parties and the Hill. And then we also could see, even as early as tomorrow, the possibility that the president could talk about an emergency funding and declaration for the wall. The next few days are going to be interesting, and to John's point, I'm not going to get a lot of sleep. So,
there have been a variety of compromises offered and rejected, and some of those involve trading money for walls, fences, peaches, I believe it was referred to once, for progress on DACA and TPS and other things. Are those things on the table, or are we now just so far apart that it's sort of a war to the death, and it's all about who wins and who loses?
So I want to, many of you know, the president put forth a proposal about 2 weeks ago, and it was framed as a great compromise. I think before we get to the pieces of the enforcement, there was a sign of positivity in that this is the first time this president has mentioned, in a national address no less, the need for DACA recipients and TPS recipients protections. That's a positive development. The problem? The protections really were not all that real. In fact, for the DACA population, they're illusory. The DACA population already has those protections, and as the Supreme Court is deciding not to take the case, these individuals have these temporary protections for the time being. But the reality is that particularly for the Dreamers, which is the larger population of young people who were brought here, who maybe don't have the DACA status, but very much, I think, deserve and would like to have permanent status, we have to continue to advocate for them. They need to continue to be part of the national discussion, and it is part of the larger immigration reform that the bishops continue to advocate for. That being said, this is a negotiation. And sometimes the problem here in Washington, and we're removed from McAllen and the human reality, is that sometimes we put up people as negotiating chips. And that's terrible. We should never be sacrificing one group over another. I don't think the populations themselves would want that. And we need to remember the human elements that some of my colleagues have talked about. This is more than a negotiation over funding. This is people's lives.
Okay. There are two ways that people can participate in our discussion. I should have mentioned this before. You can join our conversation on #BeyondTheWall online, and shortly we'll invite you to offer questions. We have a mic or two that we can pass around. Let me go sort of where we ended up with. What is the moral status of a wall? What makes a wall moral or immoral? What makes it defensible, worth funding, or requires you to oppose it? And related to that, when we think about all that's at stake here, the president's promise, the lives of the people who come to the respite shelter, the TPS and DACA students, and ordinary immigrants who don't have any status, who pick our food, who drive our taxis, who clean our offices and our hotels, who don't have TPS, don't have DACA. They're only the lifeblood of our community. So what is fundamental? What is negotiable? What do you do in a country that's really divided about all this? And I throw that open. So what's the moral status of a wall? And secondly, what are the fundamentals and what is negotiable, and what can you do to try and help people come out of the shadows?
Well, I would just say, first of all, if you want to read the Bible, you turn to Nehemiah. There's building a wall was actually a holy task that God had made provision for. I don't think we can say that the walls in themselves are problematic. They're certainly useful, and I have a wall around my yard, and it keeps out the deer mostly, and that's a good thing. I think that in our current discourse, it's become a symbol of exclusion, and that's what I think is deeply problematic. We have already fences and walls of various kinds. I've been in the border a couple places that have seen some of them, and they have a place. But as President Reagan said famously, in his vision, if our country needed to have walls, then it should also have doors, and the doors should be open. And so that's the real question, is how do we keep our doors open? Because most people prefer to go through a door than climbing over a wall. It's just a matter that right now the system of the doors tend to be mostly shut, and not many people are being allowed in.
Yeah. David, Galen as Nehemiah, we have encyclicals. Help us understand the moral status of a barrier, and also what's fundamental, what's negotiable.
Well, I mean, I would agree with Galen that the way the wall is operating right now is as a symbol. But I would say, I agree with you, it's operating as a symbol of exclusion, but it's also operating in another way, I think, in our country, namely a symbol of protection for some people in this country who are really hurting. There are a lot of less educated whites who supported Donald Trump because they thought he was going to bring them out of a situation of desperation. Angus Deaton, who's a very distinguished economist at Princeton, has documented what he calls the lives of desperation being lived by poorly educated, white, working class, or unemployed people in the US. He's documented that the death rate of white people with less than a high school education has been increasing. And it's been increasing because of suicide, because of drug abuse, because of alcoholism, all of which he says are symbols of desperation. Well, the people who are in that desperate condition are afraid of immigrants coming in to make their situation even worse. I think they're misunderstanding what immigration does, because actually immigration, generally speaking, makes the economy improve. And that's certainly true of refugees above all else. But we have to find a way of addressing the needs of those people in our country who are less educated, who are poor, who are vulnerable, who are seeing the migrants as people who have to be excluded in order to protect themselves. And in order to do that, we need to address the economic justice question in this country, so that we can also address the justice question of how to deal with migrants. So if we could address the need for protection among some of the people who are poorer in this country, we might reduce the tendency of the wall to serve as a symbol of exclusion.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate David talking about class and exclusion. We also have to talk about race and ethnicity. I'm from Minnesota. We have a border. No one's talking about building a wall. And there are a couple things that are different. One, it's awfully cold. But secondly, we're not talking about Mexicans and Guatemalans and Salvadorans. I think race and ethnicity has a lot to do with this. The two women on this panel are on the front lines. You're on the front lines on the border. You're on the front lines at Capitol Hill. As you look at this impasse, what is fundamental? What is negotiable? How do we push our leaders to act for the common good, to use a word that comes out of our tradition?
Well, I would just say, there's some labeling about the wall that if you are opposed to the wall, that you're for open borders. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think that there's a vision that can be made for border security and a desire for us to keep our country safe, but also talk about the fact that we need humane immigration reform. It's really important to understand Catholic social teaching recognizes the right of nations to control their borders. But with that right comes a responsibility. And the responsibility is that that enforcement, that it's humane and just and frankly transparent, not only to those who are looking to access the protection, but to US citizens as well. $5 billion is the initial starting point. That's what is being put up here, up to $25 billion. There is no documented proof that a wall is necessarily going to make us any safer. And I think it's important to push back from the paradigm that if you are not for the wall, you're not necessarily for keeping communities safe. I think you've seen some evidence of policy-based solutions, but there are plenty of other things that could be put forward as a vision for border security that really addresses, in the framework of Catholic social teaching, what is the problem. A good example is this idea of root causes. What are we doing as a country to help immigrants and refugees who are in situations of persecution? Are we providing aid that gives infrastructure and economic opportunity, or is it solely enforcement-based? I don't think you can talk about a policy of deterrence without talking about helping the home country. What about access to justice for these populations so we can make a determination as to who qualifies here in this country? Well, we have an immigration backlog of 800,000 cases that was made worse with the shutdown. We need more immigration judges, and we need more access to legal orientation programs. Furthermore, we have a trade issue as it relates to what products come in between when we think about ports of entry. Infrastructure there has long needed improvement. These are all other policy-based solutions that we can talk about when we talk about wanting to secure the border. That doesn't necessarily mean a wall or an increase in immigrant detention beds and outrageous costs to US taxpayers.
Sister? Good. On the other front line, what does a path forward look like?
You know, John, I live at the border. I've lived there all my life. And I've lived most of my life without a wall or a fence or anything like that. And we were fine. Our area is very safe. We go and come back and forth. And it wasn't a problem until at one point they put a fence for us. And it really created a division between our existence as to who we were in a community with our neighbors in Mexico and people coming and going. And most of the wall or the fence that was put was dividing a lot of our communities in the US. It's amazingly how if you go to the border today, you actually will have the wall or the fence before you get to the river, which is Mexico. So a mile before the fence is already there, and part of our community lives on the other side of the fence. They have to key in the code that Border Patrol does to get into their house or their neighborhood. And so it really disrupts a lot of our own communities. And so we don't see anything stopping because of that fence that we already have. People continue to come and go, and drugs continue to be part of the operation of the criminal element of the cartels or whoever is bringing that drugs across. So the wall does not keep any of the bad stuff that you want to keep out from coming in. And so I just see the fact that what we're creating is people who are trying to come into our country asking for protection, for safety, people who are not criminals, people who are nice people who are really, truly only trying to protect their children, their families, and they have a difficult time to even come through a point of entry. If you go today to the border, and you actually will see hundreds of families waiting on the other side of the points of entry to try to enter our country asking for this protection and safety, and they can't, and they have to wait for months out in the middle of nowhere where they don't have any food, anything. People, out of their generosity, cross the border bridge to take them food daily and to keep them from when it rains to try to put something so they cannot get wet and things like that. We are creating a crisis at the border ourselves by not providing a means of these families to enter legally through the United States ports of entry to ask for protection and to safety. We force them to enter through more difficult and unsafe areas where they could die when they try to go through the brushes or through the desert, and even to climb the wall, they do that. So what we see at the border are a lot of ways that we make it more difficult as a country for people to be safe and to be safe from harm. And so it's unfortunate that we are not putting a greater effort and building up the capacity at our ports of entry so that safer passage can happen for all these families.
Okay. Kim, who has the microphone? Okay. Anna's back. As we go to that, help me with one thing, and I learned this. Describe who walks in the door, what happens to them, and where do they go?
At our center.
At your center. I mean,
so
you were my hero before I even knew what you did.
John. So what happens is that families, when they enter our country, Border Patrol will apprehend and process them. And what they do at the Border Patrol will sort out and see who is entering our country, and those that are criminals are set aside to certain sections. Those that are individual adults will be sent somewhere. Those that are children that are not coming with their mom or dad are put under certain other protection. Those families who come, children with parents, then they are sent to a family detention facility. But in most cases today, those family detention facilities are packed. And so they have to release those families to give them permission to travel to another point in the United States where they can continue that legal processing, immigration process somewhere else where they're going, and they can do that. They meet a certain family profile where there's a sense of safety. They're asylum seekers, and they will then be brought to us at the respite center. Our respite center is a place where the community comes together and receives these families, provides them the immediate care they need, put them in contact with their family, give them an opportunity to take a shower, to get cleaned up, to eat a nice warm soup, see a doctor, rest, and then continue their journey and guide them as to what they need to do when they go beyond this point, how to go to their own immigration hearings and how important that is, and how to keep themselves safe. That's our job.
I would just want to add, through our Catholic Charities Network, we've had the opportunity to help some of the families that Sister Norma receives as they move into the interior. We have never encountered a family who said, I don't want to comply with my immigration proceeding. We've never encountered someone who said, I'm here and I'm going to try and evade the law. They always ask tons of questions about how do I check in with ICE if I need to? How do I show up for my court hearing? What do I have to do to help enroll my children into school? And frequently, it's faith-based groups that are on the front lines of assisting, whether it's Catholic Charities legal service providers, whether it's parishes. This is a population that we strongly believe, if they are given the opportunity to be educated about what they need to do, and if they're given the opportunity to fully be accompanied and encountered and embraced in their community, they look to comply with the immigration court laws that are there. And I think it's really important to understand this. There's this perception that these families are leaving Sister Norma's or other places and they don't care. Not a family has said, I don't want to show up to my court hearing. Instead, it's, please, can you help me? How do I do this? How can I get an attorney that I have to pay for myself? We see great interest and desire to do everything they can to comply with our processes here.
Okay. Join us, hashtag Beyond the Wall. Raise your hand if you have a question. And Anna, well, here's a question down here and a question over here, up there. I'll use my line. Please put your question in the form of a question.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook, and I've been covering immigration for over 10 years. So many words have become now almost toxic, and one of them is deportation. And I'd like you to address deportation. For a while, people were talking about humanitarian deportation. Now it seems to me that anybody who's deported that is really immoral. So could you address how, especially people of faith, feel about deportations?
Galen?
Well, it's many times it's a deeply sad occasion because it's people that we know and love who are being torn from their roots. Many times that involves breaking up families because maybe the children are U.S. citizens and are not deported, but the parents are deported. It creates fear and uncertainty in many families. How would you feel if every morning when you left home, you didn't know if you're coming back, your kids didn't know if you're coming back? It's just very, very traumatic in many cases. So are there alternatives? Well, certainly for people who have been here for a long time, it seems that integration is a better solution than deportation, and our laws ought to accommodate that. If people must be deported, it's generally better if it can be done voluntarily, and if there's reasonable time is given for preparations. But I guess I would acknowledge that if there was never any deportation, it would make our laws somewhat difficult or unworkable, or it might undermine support for the overall system. But as much as possible, I think it ought to be avoided.
Yeah. One of my, this is not our first discussion of immigration, as you said, but Cardinal Tobin of New Jersey was here at Georgetown, and one of the things I remember is his describing how he went with someone in the community to a deportation hearing and helped make the case that this was a loss not only for this family but for the whole community. And amazingly, his deportation was stayed. So maybe some of us ought to stand up for our neighbors. There was one up there and then one over here I saw. Anna, right here in the middle. If you could stand up, that'd be great.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Sure.
I'm Cecilia Cervantes, and I work at George Mason University, and I'm also a catechist in the Diocese of Arlington. So my question is we have a crisis, but that requires support for a lot of people in need, and we traditionally think of migrants and refugees, but also what about those in spiritual poverty? What should we do as Catholic leaders to minister to those that struggle with welcoming the stranger?
Sure. Sister, talk about the faith dimension of this, and maybe David as well.
Well, I believe that one of the things that I see every day with the many hundreds of families that arrive to our center is that one of the things they have is the strongest faith. You know, they really, we witness to a faith in the immigrants, the refugees, that I'm in awe. When I experienced, for example, sometimes when we didn't have room at the respite center, we would bring them to the convent hall and have them sleep there. But we have a chapel, and they discover the chapel, and you just see a father go kneel before the Blessed Sacrament and the image of Jesus and cry in gratitude to our Lord, and in words that a father is just communicating with God in a very, very beautiful way, that I just can't believe how we could not be part of the richness of faith that these families bring to our country. And so I think that we here must experience that, must see that, must witness, must encounter them, so that we too can be nourished and be filled with that presence of God because of that encounter. I think that that's why I invite everyone. You need to come. You need to have the opportunity to experience what it is to be present with these families, because they fill us with God's presence.
Anything to add, David?
Well, I mean, I'm reminded of when Pope Francis spoke to the joint session of the United States Congress back a couple of years ago, he had an extraordinary speech in which one of the things he spoke about was response to migrants. And it seems to me that he did two things there. One, he evoked our deep biblical faith on why we should be responding adequately and more adequately to migrants and refugees. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love others as you would have them love you. And then he reminded the members of the Congress who were standing before him or sitting before him that most of them had come from families who were themselves immigrants. And indeed, in many cases, they came from families who had been refugees, who had been fleeing persecution. And I think about, the Speaker of the House who was sitting behind the Pope when he gave his speech, John Boehner. He came from a German immigrant family. His successor, Paul Ryan, came from an Irish immigrant family, fleeing from the famine, which could be claimed to be a source of persecution, or because the British had some pretty nasty things that they were doing at the time of the famine. And thirdly, our speaker today, Nancy Pelosi, comes from an Italian immigrant family. So maybe our congresspeople should be reminded, they're all Catholics, of this obligation that they have in faith to love their neighbors, including those neighbors coming from the south across the border. But it might be easier for them to do that if they remembered where they came from.
Well,
anyway, that would be a good step in the right direction.
and each of them are old enough to remember when it was said of John Kennedy he shouldn't be president because he was Irish Catholic. I ask questions, I don't answer. Thank you for your question on evangelization. I just want to share a little experience. Our little parish in Cheverly, St. Ambrose, the evangelization that's going on is mutual, but it's especially, we're being especially enriched by the renewed vitality of our parish brought by our Latino members. I've told the story before. I remember an old Anglo like me came out of Mass, what's happening to our parish? And usually it's about the parking lot or the time of Masses. And I said, it's being renewed. And he said, what do you mean renewed? And I said, it's really simple. We do funerals, they do baptisms. For us, if Mass goes 1 minute beyond an hour, we're up in arms. And our Latino members of our parish are teaching the rest of us what a real family of faith looks like. So I think the evangelization is mutual, and I, for one, have a lot to learn from immigrants. Over here, there are a bunch of questions. David? Down in front here. Let's start here, and then we'll move back.
I have a question regarding the new president of Mexico, López Obrador. He's offered something that I don't hear very much talk about, but I think it's significant in this discussion as well as others, and that is a Marshall Plan for Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle countries. And most of these people, I think most will agree, would like to stay at home where their relatives are and their families are and their neighborhoods are. So could you comment on that proposal and maybe suggest ways in which we could lift it up as a discussion point in all of this?
So I'll start. First off, I do think it's good that the new administration is looking into a Marshall-type plan, but I do want to flag that it's in a suite of proposals that would directly impact some of the families that Sister Norma sees on the border. There's a new initiative that's been put forth by our president called the Remain in Mexico policy, and this is a policy that says you cannot, those asylum seekers, the families that Sister sees, you can no longer cross in between a port of entry. You have to cross at a port of entry. You get a number with a Department of Homeland Security official, and then you need to go back and wait in Mexico. maybe it doesn't sound so bad on the face of it. However, the reality is that these are people who have traveled a long way and are very vulnerable. Many are children traveling with families. Where they are being asked to stay, sometimes for months at a time, are unsecure. The UNHCR has just opened an office in Tijuana, and their staff cannot stay in the evenings. They don't spend the night there because it's deemed too dangerous. And yet this is where we want these families just to stay. So, you know, I think Mexico is in a new period of negotiation with our president. I think ideas to give more avenues for protection, you know, from other countries is part of the puzzle, but I don't think that it should be at cost for those who are here now and seeking protection. Yeah. And so I think it's really important. Unfortunately, we don't know all the details of this Remain in Mexico policy. Both administrations are still working those out. There's been some media coverage about it, but it is with quite a bit of strings that I think as a people we should be careful about.
Galen, I think what David's talking about is a broader question of development assistance in Central America, and that would allow people to find a decent life at home. The evangelical community, the Catholic community, the religious community has been a strong advocate of development assistance and investment at home so people are not pushed forward. Do you see any prospects of trying to refocus some of this debate in that direction?
Well, certainly the money that's in play could be put to a lot better use, a lot of it, in doing that kind of thing. And we definitely, as you say, have been supporting increases in development funding. I think I don't really like to see it framed as being, let's spend the money there so we can keep these people away, because these people are actually, as we've been talking about, blessings to us. So it's not that we're unwilling to receive people here, but certainly for those where it would be possible for them to stay, I think it's a lot of it has to do with security as well as just livelihoods. From what I understand, many people find it quite dangerous living in the places where, especially the young people, and so things that would bring about better governance as well as economic development would be quite important, and it would help us as well. We would benefit if those countries were more prosperous.
Okay. A couple more here.
I'm Jean Salmon. I'm a freelance advocate at this point. My question was related to that. I was going to ask if anybody is thinking about ways of addressing the push factors that are making these people feel so unsafe. I asked somebody about that one time, and she said President Obama tried to get aid to some of these countries, but the governments are just so corrupt that it didn't work. I mean, I think we need a more longer-term, broader thought about that. So let me ask a different question then that's related, and it might sound a little strange, but could some of these people get asylum in Mexico? I mean, they wouldn't have to walk that far. They could be in a country where they're speaking the language. Is Mexico in a position to do more for people in Central America?
Sister?
Well, I think Mexico itself is struggling a lot, you know, and it's not a very wealthy country, and people there don't have it easy, and there's also a lot of corruption as well, and unsafety. And so one of the things that happens to the immigrants when they're stuck in Mexico, they're easy targets for attacks because they're they're so vulnerable that the criminal elements are after them, searching them to abuse them and take advantage of them. So they're not safe in Mexico. They try to evade all kinds of dangers so they can make it to a safer space, which they hope is in the United States.
Let's take a couple questions, one over here and then one over here. Is there anybody over there? Down here?
Hi, my name's David. I'm from across the river in Arlington.
So some borders you can get across.
Well, except for the traffic jam.
Things are really going well in Virginia. Congratulations.
Let's not rush to judgment.
Okay.
Please, let's not rush to judgment.
We
Seriously.
have no problems here.
I heard it mentioned once, and I'd like the panel, if anyone's really knowledgeable, that as much as there is this obsession about the southern border, there are presumably many people who enter this country legally as tourists or as students and overstay their border or overstay their visas, and that these numbers presumably are very large. And if that's true, if you can validate that, should this be part of comprehensive immigration reform?
Ashley?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. It's estimated that, depending on the estimates, that 40 to 60% of those who are in an undocumented state are here because they were visa overstayers. I think your point about it being an element of comprehensive immigration reform is spot on, and so did the Senate in 2013. What to do with visa overstayers was one of the elements of the comprehensive immigration reform plan that did pass the Senate with large bipartisan support. I think it goes a little bit to Sister's point about this narrative about kind of what the wall is being posed to do and not to do. You know, it is important, obviously, that we look at that issue. The narrative is very difficult to overcome, though, when it's being pitched, I think, as people just coming in from the border, many times in humanitarian situations. So I think any piece of immigration reform will look to do that. To my knowledge, the negotiations that are ongoing right now in the Senate and the House on the DHS kind of conferees, that's not really being one of the elements that is being addressed. It is a focused discussion on detention beds, the wall, port infrastructure, and some of these narrow pieces. But yes, your point is well taken. It is something that we need to think about if we think about a larger, true comprehensive vision of reform, but also kind of security measures of our immigration system.
Okay, one more question.
I'm Tom Howarth. I live in Front Royal, Virginia. I know a little bit about, thank you. I know a little bit about El Salvador, and in the introduction, it was mentioned that Maurice's country was the financing of the war on behalf of the governments and the military in El Salvador was done by the United States. And if they had not financed the war, the government and the military of El Salvador wouldn't have lasted very long. So the point is, we have people coming to our border and saying, well, here are the Salvadorans, we can't help them, don't come in. We went into their country, and we not only killed tens of thousands of campesinos, but also a saint and 6 Jesuit priests. So my question is fairly simple, I think. If you've gone someplace and made a big mess, don't you have a responsibility to clean it up?
I think the audience answered the question. Before I ask our panelists for a final comment, let me give you a little previews of coming attractions and a word of thanks. We are working on a number of dialogues. Some of you are familiar with our Salt and Light program for young leaders in Washington. We're working on a session on Capitol Hill with new members of Congress on how their faith shapes their service. We're focused on a session much like this would address issues of work and workers, both the dignity and the rights of workers. We have a tradition of focusing on the leadership of Pope Francis. It's a more challenging topic these days than it has been. We're doing a session with the Georgetown Law School on how the law has contributed to the sexual abuse crisis and help expose the sexual abuse crisis and how it could be a part of the solution. And we'll be continuing to focus on lay leadership in public life and ecclesial life. I want to thank especially Jacqueline for her wonderful opening. Your father ought to be really proud, not only of tonight, but what a wonderful daughter he has, who stood for him tonight. I want to thank Kim Daniels and Anna Misla, the three musketeers here. I want to thank Claire and Nicolo and Purby, who helped us, and others who have assisted us. Stop on the way out. If you have not signed up for our list, be sure your name is on the list. We have a new one-pager on the initiative. I'm sure you're going to devour. It's just fascinating reading. We have a reception for everybody who can join us up in the atrium, just up those stairs. Nice desserts, wine, coffee, sodas. And I'd like to close by asking each of our panelists for just a brief word of hope. We mostly focus on the mess we're in. Where do you find a sign of hope in this? And let's go, Galen, and down the road.
Well, thank you, John. I think we need to see the hand of God in the movement of peoples around the world. In his Mars Hill speech in Acts chapter 17, Paul talks about how God determines the place where every person should live. And what we have found in our country is that God has brought people to our shores from virtually every country in the world. And it has been a great blessing. Evangelical Christians and Catholics as well for many, many years have been sending missionaries all over the world. Now God is sending some of those people to us. Some of them are actually coming here as missionaries to us. Some are people who are now living in our communities, and we have the opportunity to befriend and share the gospel with them. So whatever happens in Washington and in our capital and our administration and so on, that's not where I put my hope. We can put our hope in the fact that God is in charge and that God is accomplishing his purposes, and that we see his gracious hand at work in all of these issues that we're discussing.
Ashley, sign of hope?
Well, this weekend and tomorrow is the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering. And tomorrow morning, over 500 Catholic activists, practitioners, diocesan employees, volunteers, students are going to go to Capitol Hill and advocate on including protections for dreamers and TPS recipients, and making sure that we don't cut protections for asylum seekers or unaccompanied children. They're from all 50 states. And they're going to basically use their voices. And so I'm thankful for them. I think this is how we will get out of this. I think it's using our voice and, frankly, using the experience that we have in our communities and lifting up the human element of this. That's really going to be how we move forward on this. And so to me, the fact that they're going, what they're going to say, the stories and experiences they're going to bring, that's what this is about.
David, a word of hope?
I think that if we look at the experience of the Catholic community in the United States, it indicates to us that if refugees and migrants are given the right opportunities and support, they can become extremely effective presence and very successful in this country. The Catholic Church has created an enormous network of schools, hospitals, social service agencies, and they were initially created to deal with immigrants. All those Catholics that were coming from Ireland and Poland and Italy and so forth, we created all these schools for them, and we created all these hospitals for them and so forth. And it's enabled them to move forward, to become good Americans, to become part of our community. And so it's a sign of hope, it seems to me, that if the church devotes itself carefully and with very good planning to responding to the needs of immigrants and refugees, it really can make a difference. the difference is probably many of the people in this room right now wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the church's initiative in those areas. And so that's a sign of hope, it seems to me.
Sister?
I see hope every day at the respite center because I see people, generous people that walk through our doors to help the immigrants, to welcome them. And people that come from everywhere, from Minnesota, from Wisconsin, couples that just show up, religious sisters that come by in groups that retired and spent 2 weeks with us and live filled with this sense of wonder that how wonderful it was for me to be here. They give me hope because they show that we will do a difference in the life of that person we have in front of us, whoever that is. And the more we are able to pass on that hope, the more of us will be doing the right thing. It's with us. We should not feel hopeless because it is beautiful to see our faith alive in everyone that is touched by God's calling to reach out and welcome the stranger and make a difference in their lives. And that's where the hope is.
The joint. There's a part of me, being from Minnesota, to say those folks from Minnesota and Wisconsin may be just trying to get out of the cold. But I don't believe
too.
that.
I think they said that we're fortunate that we're not in.
I find hope in the presence of you tonight in such numbers, and in particular, I find hope in the leadership of these 4 people plus Jacqueline. Join me in thanking them for their service. And join us upstairs.